Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, so when you think about space, maybe you picture, astronauts floating around, scientists in lab coats.
Right, the classic image.
Yeah,
Maybe the moon landing footage.
exactly. But that picture, it's changing, like really fast. Space is turning into something else, something,
Well,
well, commercial.
it really is. It feels less like pure exploration and more like a new frontier for business, almost like a gold rush.
That's the perfect term for it, a cosmic gold rush. We've been digging into a whole bunch of sources looking at this shift, trying to figure out, what's driving it, who are the big players, and what does it all mean?
And it's not just theoretical anymore, is it? You see concrete examples cropping up all the time.
Totally. Like, take the upcoming Axiom 4 mission. You've got astronauts from India, Poland, Hungary, heading to the International Space Station. Sounds pretty standard, maybe.
Yeah, sounds like typical international cooperation, which is great.
But here's the kicker, the thing that signals the change. It's being run, start to finish, by a private company, Axiom Space.
Ah, okay. So not a government space agency calling the shots.
Nope. A private outfit orchestrating this multinational crew going to the ISS. That one detail tells you almost everything you need to know about how much things are shifting.
It really does. It shows the doors to space aren't just held open by governments now. Private players have their own keys.
And, before we dive deep into the economics and the players, there was this one detail from our sources that really stuck with me. It's kind of weird, actually.
Oh, yeah. What was that?
The smell of space. Or, well, the smell associated with space. You'd think vacuum, right? No smell.
Right. Nothingness.
But people who've been around return equipment or in simulators, they describe this distinct smell like spent gunpowder, maybe burnt steak, ozone.
Huh. Gunpowder and burnt steak. That's not what I would have expected.
Me neither. But I think it matters because it makes this whole giant abstract concept feel a bit more real, more tangible. It's not just a void, it's becoming a workplace, a place people interact with.
That's a great point. It grounds it. Makes the idea of doing business up there
Yeah.
feel less sci-fi and more, well, industrial almost.
Exactly. So that's our mission for this deep dive. Unpack what's fueling this commercial space age, get a handle on who's involved, and look at the huge potential, but also the pretty significant risks tied up in this cosmic gold rush.
Okay, let's maybe start with a little context. The original space race back in the day, that was all about the U.S. and the Soviet Union, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. Pure superpower rivalry. Planting flags, national pride, hitting milestones like the moon landing first. It was all geopolitics.
Driven by the Cold War, essentially.
Yeah.
Pushing technology, sure, but for dominance.
Right. But this new space age, as people are calling it, feels totally different. The comparison you hear a lot is to the age of exploration, Columbus, Magellan.
Oh, okay. Multiple players, not just two big ones, all
Yeah.
chasing something out there. Treasure, trade rates.
Yeah, exactly. But instead of ships, it's rockets. And it's not just nations. It's these private companies, maybe even more so, chasing, value, resources maybe, new markets, access.
And that's the core difference, isn't it? Who's actually doing the work?
Yeah.
NASA, Roscosmos, they're still important. Funding things, being customers.
Sure, huge customers.
But the innovation, the speed, building the rockets, running the missions, increasingly that's falling to the private sector.
And the amount of money potentially on the table is just staggering. We saw a projection saying the global space economy could hit, $1.8 trillion by 2035?
Yeah, $1.8 trillion. That kind of number changes everything. It shifts space from being this public service funded by taxes to a potentially massive marketplace.
So where does all that value actually come from? It's not just launching astronauts, right?
No, not at all. A huge chunk is satellite constellations. Think Starlink, providing internet globally. That's transformative. Then there's space tourism, which is starting to, take off, albeit for the super rich.
Yeah.
And longer term, people are talking seriously about mining asteroids for valuable minerals, or maybe even manufacturing things in zero gravity where you can make unique materials.
Wow. Okay, so the driver has really shifted from national glory to straight up economic opportunity, which brings us to the companies actually making this happen.
Yeah, the private players, they're really setting the pace now.
So who are some of the key ones we need to know about? Axiom Space, obviously, running that mission we mentioned.
Right. And Axiom's role is fascinating. They're not just building stuff. They're kind of like a space travel agent, or maybe a space station property manager.
A cosmic Airbnb was one phrase used.
Huh? Yeah, that fits. They're essentially brokering access to the ISS for countries or researchers who don't have their own rockets, making space accessible in a whole new way.
It really flips the old model.
Yeah.
And then you have the companies building the actual rides, the infrastructure. SpaceX comes to mind immediately.
Absolutely. SpaceX has been revolutionary, particularly with reusable rockets. Their ability to build, test, fly, and iterate so quickly has dramatically lowered launch costs. That's a huge enabler for this whole commercial boom.
Making space cheaper to get to is fundamental.
Definitely. But it's not only the headline-grabbing rocket companies. You've got firms like Rocket Lab USA, for example. They've carved out a niche and are actually profitable in the space system side, designing components, managing satellites once they're up there.
Okay, so it's a whole ecosystem developing, not just the launch pads, but everything needed to operate in space.
Exactly. It's the supply chain, the services. These companies aren't just waiting for government contracts anymore. They're often venture-funded, pushing the envelope, sometimes even driving policy.
Which makes India's story in all this really stand out, doesn't it? Their journey seems to capture this whole shift perfectly.
It really does. It's quite an arc. You look back at the early days of ISRO, the Indian Space Agency.
Yeah, those famous pictures, rocket parts being moved on bicycles, satellite bits on bullock carts. Talk about doing amazing things on a shoestring budget.
Incredible ingenuity born from constraints.
Yeah.
And then you fast forward to 2023.
Chandrayaan-3, landing near the lunar South Pole.
Successfully, making India only the 4th country to land on the moon and the first to nail that tricky South Polar region. That's a massive leap from bullock carts to the lunar South Pole.
It sends a huge signal about their capabilities and ambition, and they're not stopping. They're talking about missions to Venus, putting an Indian astronaut on the moon.
Right, which brings us back again to Axiom 4. Having an Indian astronaut on that flight, the first since Rakesh Sharma flew way back in 1984 on a Soviet mission.
Yeah, nearly 40 years.
But this time, it's on a commercial flight brokered by a private company. It underlines India's evolution from being, maybe a passenger on other nations' rides to being a key player in this new commercial space environment.
And it seems their government is leaning into this, right? Pushing privatization.
Very much so. They've opened the doors, and it's sparked this whole wave of Indian space startups. Companies building small sats, developing launch vehicles.
Yeah.
It's creating a really dynamic domestic space industry.
It's exciting to see that kind of growth. But, with any gold rush, there's always the other side of the coin. The challenges, the risks. It's not all smooth sailing.
No, definitely not. Space is still incredibly hard.
Mm.
Even a high-profile mission like Axiom 4 had hiccups, right? Aborted countdowns, delays. That reminds you that physics doesn't care if you're private or public.
True. And that difficulty gets magnified when you think about how much agencies like NASA are now relying on these private companies for really critical things.
Yeah, like getting their own astronauts to the space station on SpaceX capsules, or planning future moon landings using landers built by private firms. It raises big questions about oversight and, frankly, reliability.
Especially when the bottom line, profit, is a major factor. Is there a risk that companies might, cut corners on safety or testing to save money? In an environment where one mistake can be catastrophic.
It's a fundamental tension you have to watch very closely. And then there's just the sheer volume issue. More launches, more satellites, especially these huge commercial constellations.
It means more junk up there.
Exactly. The problem of space debris is getting worse, fast. Low Earth orbit is crowded. A collision up there doesn't just destroy 2 satellites. It creates thousands of new pieces of shrapnel, increasing the risk for everyone. The cosmic landfill scenario is a real worry.
And who cleans it up? Or who's responsible if a piece of commercial debris hits, say, the ISS or someone else's satellite?
That's the regulatory nightmare, isn't it? International space law was written for nations, mostly. Many of these private companies aren't signatories to treaties like the Outer Space Treaty or even newer guidelines like the Artemis Accords.
Which India signed, interestingly.
Right. India signed the Artemis Accords, committing to certain principles for peaceful exploration. But what happens if a company from a non-signatory country causes a problem? Who do you hold accountable? The legal framework is lagging way behind the commercial reality.
We basically need new rules of the road for space, but ones that include companies, not just countries.
Urgently.
Yeah.
And that ties into another big question. Access. If space travel and operations become mainly commercial, driven by profit, what about affordability?
Yeah, you mentioned those $50 million price tags for private astronaut flights. That's not exactly democratizing space, is it?
Not even close.
Hmm.
Even these Axiom-style missions, while bringing in more countries, are still very expensive. Is space just going to become a playground for billionaires and rich nations? How do we make sure the benefits are shared?
It's a huge ethical question alongside the technical and economic ones. And speaking of friction, earthly politics don't just disappear at the edge of the atmosphere, do they?
Unfortunately not. All the tensions we see down here, they extend right up into orbit. Space assets are just too critical now.
How so? What kind of assets are we talking about?
Well, everything from communication satellites that run our internet and phones, to GPS for navigation, to spy satellites for intelligence, even weather monitoring. Modern life and military operations are incredibly dependent on space.
Which makes those assets potential targets.
Precisely. The rivalry between, say, the U.S. and China plays out in space capabilities. Regional tensions, like between India and Pakistan, also have a space dimension. It's seen as a strategic high ground.
I remember reading about discussions, maybe at the Shangri-La dialogue last year, talking about a potential new Cold War and space being a key domain.
Exactly. The concern is that space could become an actual battlefield. Not necessarily with, space fighters like in movies, but through things like jamming or destroying satellites, cyber attacks on ground control, or even space stations.
Crippling an enemy's communication or navigation, that would be devastating.
It could be. And the more commercial infrastructure goes up, the more potential targets or potential sources of conflict there are. It adds another layer of complexity and risk.
Man, it really complicates the exciting exploration narrative.
Yeah.
But let's bring it back down to Earth, or almost for a second. That smell of space thing.
Ah, yes, the gunpowder and burned steak.
It's such a weird, grounding detail. It makes you think about the sheer physicality of it all. Beyond the sleek rockets and digital displays, it's a harsh, industrial environment they're working in.
It does humanize it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And some of the other concepts are just wild to picture, like actually mining an asteroid. What does that even look like? Robots grappling onto a rock flying through space?
Right, or space tourism. We see the headlines, the huge cost, but the day-to-day reality for those tourists is probably still pretty intense. Freeze-dried food, cramped quarters, the sheer physical toll. It's not a luxury cruise.
Not yet, anyway. It underscores that even with all the commercial investment, we're still very much in the early pioneering phase of actually living and working in space routinely. There's a big gap between the hype and the current reality.
So looking ahead maybe towards that 2035 timeframe we mentioned, if this gold rush continues at this pace, what could space realistically look like?
Well, based on the sources, you could plausibly see things like the first dedicated space hotels in orbit, maybe small permanent research outposts on the moon, focused on science, or testing resource extraction techniques.
And just more stuff
Well,
everywhere.
definitely. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands more satellites in orbit, doing everything from high-speed internet to Earth observation for climate change or agriculture. Orbit will be a much busier place.
Which brings us right back to those challenges. How on earth do you manage all that traffic? How do you regulate this booming industry? Someone described it as like herding cats in zero gravity.
That sounds about right. Seriously, though, who gets to set the traffic rules? Who decides if a company can mine a particular asteroid? What are the property rights in space? If you pull valuable minerals out, who owns them?
The company, the country they're based in, all of humanity.
Nobody knows. The current international law, like the Outer Space Treaty, says space is for all mankind and celestial bodies can't be appropriated by nations. But it's silent on commercial resource extraction. It's a huge legal gray area.
And we absolutely have to figure out how to stop it becoming that cosmic landfill. Sustainability has to be baked in from the start, right? Not an afterthought.
It has to be. Because if we render orbits unusable due to debris, we lose all the benefits space offers. And maybe the biggest question underpinning all of this.
'Cause how do we make sure this actually benefits everyone?
Exactly. How do we ensure that the amazing potential better global communication, tools to fight climate change, new scientific discoveries, doesn't just end up benefiting a tiny elite? How do we avoid creating even greater divides?
That seems like the central challenge for the next decade or two, finding that balance between encouraging innovation and ensuring responsibility and equity.
And nations like India, perhaps, with their track record of frugal innovation, but also their commitment to international norms, might be really important voices in shaping that more balanced future.
So when you boil it all down, this Axiom 4 mission we started with, it's really just one frame in a much bigger movie playing out. A movie about a fundamental shift in how humanity interacts with space.
Yeah, it's this messy, exciting, slightly scary mix of incredible technological progress, unexpected realities like the smell, and huge questions about our future.
The cosmic gold rush is well underway. It promises transformation, but forces us to confront some really big challenges.
It definitely pushes us into new territory, literally and figuratively.
And it leaves us all with something pretty profound to think about, doesn't it? As space becomes less of a pristine frontier and more a bustling marketplace, what is our collective responsibility here? When you look up tonight, what role do you think we should play in how this cosmic gold rush unfolds?